Hello, New Prospect. Welcome to RTB 2021 for September the 17th, 2021. Hope you're doing well today. I hope you've had a great week so far on this Friday, and we're getting close to the end of the week. And so it's always a good thing to close our week with the scriptures, right? So we've got 2 Samuel 13 today. That's a challenging text in a number of ways, and an uncomfortable one in a number of ways as well. We've got 2 Corinthians 6, Ezekiel 20, and then finally we have Psalm 66 and 67. So why don't we start with 2 Corinthians 6. I'm there in my Bible again, so we'll start out with that. Now, 2 Corinthians 6 is kind of continuing, at least the first 13 verses, is a continuation of Paul's argument that he was making in 2 Corinthians 5, where he was talking about his own ministry of reconciliation, and now he's urging the Corinthians to be reconciled to him. So, for instance, in verse 11 and 13, he talks about how they have, Paul has opened his heart, and his companions have opened his heart wide to the Corinthians. Now he's hoping they will return it in like exchange, he says in verse 13, to them. And so he also, we also have a quotation, a very, very familiar verse to some of you in verses 1 and 2, where he talks about the acceptable time I listened to you, day of salvation I helped you. Now is the acceptable time. Now is the day of salvation. So again, urging them not to receive the grace of God in vain, as he says here. And it's now is the time to do that. Don't wait on it. And then verses 14 through really verse 1 of chapter 7, Paul takes a different turn in his argument here, I think you could say, where he starts, this is again after urging the Corinthians to be reconciled to God. He urges them to separate themselves out from anything unclean in Corinth. Well, that's not easy, because in Corinth, there's a lot of uncleanness. There's a lot of paganism there, as famously known for its immorality, famously known for its idolatry. And so Paul tells them, exhorts them to be separated out from that. Quotes a number of Old Testament texts here to refer to what God has done for them. And it's almost a very Old Testament message, right? God has done this for you. He's brought you into covenant relationship with himself, and therefore you should, as a people, desire to be separated out from the peoples that are around you. Touch not what is unclean, he says in verse 17, and I will welcome you. So if you'll notice, especially starting in verses 16 and following, you have a lot of Old Testament quotations here that make an argument for them not to be defiled by the culture that is surrounding them. So it's a very appropriate, I think, argument for even the church today, obviously. So 2 Corinthians 6, why don't we turn over to Ezekiel now? So in Ezekiel, Ezekiel has if you remember earlier in the book of Ezekiel, there's a visit from some of the, quote, elders of Israel to inquire of the Lord, and Ezekiel gives them an inquiry. He gives them a response to their inquiry, I guess you could say. The Lord comes and says, and then he describes in an extensive way the idolatry of Israel, and this goes all the way through verse 32 of this chapter, and it talks about how God is going to respond to that idolatry, and it's very similar in ways to a lot of Exodus imagery that's used here to describe the idolatry. Kind of the wilderness failings of Israel are revisiting them once again here in the exile. But then in verse 33, it changes to a message of restoration, and drawing on that Exodus imagery. This is a very, very much a prophetic image that is used a lot to talk about the restoration of Israel, and we've actually saw this before in the book of Jeremiah, where the restoration is put in new Exodus or second Exodus terminology. So just as God delivered the Israelites out of Egypt, the bondage they experienced there, God is going to restore his people, and he's going to do so by bringing through the wilderness, and he's going to restore them from exile. So exile, Exodus, so kind of a second Exodus out of the exile. But one of the things that just really jumped out at me again as I read through this text is just how many times, and this is very much something that we see in Exodus as well, how many times in the text, and you might even underline this as you're going through, how many times God says that I will do this for the sake of my name. So God, of course, his name represents who he is. It's his character. It's very much an ancient Near Eastern concept as well, that your name was very significant. It represented who you were. And Israel had taken God's name upon themselves, right, in the covenant, just as a husband or a bride takes on the name of the groom in a wedding. So Israel had taken on the name of Yahweh, and in violation of the 10 Commandments of those covenant documents, they had drugged God's name through the mud. They had taken his name in vain. Remember what that commandment in the 10 Commandments is all about, is to not bear or carry the name of God upon you in some empty fashion, in a way that would besmudge his name. And here we have God saying that now what he's going to do, due to the idolatry, whatever he does to discipline Israel through the exiles or other means, is for his name's sake. So verse 9, but I acted for my name's sake. Verse 14, but I acted for my name's sake. Verse 22, but I acted for my name's sake. And so on and so forth. And then even when he restores them, it is verse 44, for my name's sake. And this is, again, something that you see, if you remember all the way back to the book of Exodus. We saw that quite a bit too, didn't we? That God, when he acts for the sake of his name. When God disciplined Moses in the book of Numbers, in Numbers chapter 20, God did it because Moses had not honored God's holy name in his action before the Israelites in his rebellion at that point in the book of Numbers. So when the lesson here is that when we don't take God's name seriously, God will act for his own name's sake as a people of God. So powerful little text here in the book of Ezekiel, in Ezekiel 20. But of course, focus on the restoration there, of course, at the end. It's a beautiful picture of restoration that he has there at the end of Ezekiel 20. We'll move over to 2 Samuel 13 at this point. So remember what just happened in the story. So in the story, we just had the severe failing of David in the Bathsheba episode, confronted with his sin by Nathan the prophet. And of course, he experienced some immediate consequences for that sin. But the reverberations of that sin continue on throughout the rest of his life, really throughout the rest of 2 Samuel. The constant difficulties within his family, I think, are due to David's failings as a father, but also as a husband and as a king. And we see immediate ramifications for that sin in chapter 13. Now, that's a biblical concept, isn't it? I mean, from the very first sin in Genesis 3, we see the quick spread of sin in creation among the people of the world, with Cain and Abel, with Genesis 6, where the intent of man's heart was only evil continually. So sin can have these continued reverberations in the life of especially in the life of someone like King David, who is over so many people. Well, what are some of those reverberations here in chapter 13? Well, we have Amnon, who is technically speaking the first in line when it comes to succession. So he would be the one, just based on birth order and succession, he would have been the one to take over the kingdom. And we also have a woman named Tamar, who is one of David's children and one of his daughters. So these are not directly, they're not, how should I say this? Amnon and Tamar have the same father, but they're half brother and sister. That's what I'm trying to say. And then Absalom, who is also Tamar's sister, or Tamar's brother. So large family because of David being, having multiple wives, which is problematic as well, which introduces some chaos into the family dynamics, definitely, as we see in this chapter. So Amnon apparently desires Tamar and ends up taking advantage of her in a very brutal way in this chapter. Because of this, Absalom becomes angry, hates Tamar, hates Amnon, and ends up actually killing him, or actually having him killed at the end of this chapter, which introduces again chaos into the family dynamic. And yet, where did this all originate? Well, it all originated ultimately with David himself, with his problems and with the adversity that he introduced into the family dynamic. By the way, there probably was I think you could say a ulterior motive when it comes to Absalom in doing this, because Absalom would have been the third in line, just in birth order. And so he's kind of removing any competitors as well to his throne that he's hoping to get. As we see, he has these aspirations later on in the story. But David's sin overall, though, has created an environment where his family both victimizes other people and becomes victims themselves. It's a crazy family situation, but it started at the top, didn't it? Started with David. All right, so that's 2 Samuel 13, and that finally brings us to Psalm 66 and 67. Now, I preached on Psalm 67 a few weeks ago, if you remember. I think that was towards the beginning of our sermon series, and we talked about at the time that this is a mission, known as the missionary psalm. You'll see really both Psalm 66 and 67 have this emphasis on God not just being God to the Jews, not just being God over this small little region of Israel, but he is God over all the earth, and his desire is for all the earth to worship him. And this is contrary to, I think, the way many people believe or conceive of the Old Testament and conceive of Israel in the Old Testament, kind of being this cloistered monastic type of nation. But they've really, from the very beginning, had a missionary purpose, because God's had a missionary purpose, a missional purpose of seeing the nations come, as it says in verse 1 of Psalm 66, shout joyfully to all the earth, to God all the earth, sing glory to his name. He doesn't say, notice what it doesn't say, shout joyfully to God, O Israel, sing glory to his name, O Jacob. No, it's all the earth, right? Make his praise glorious. We see this, verse 7, he keeps his watch over the nations. Bless our God, O peoples, sound his praise abroad. So this worldwide global mission of God. God's mission is not just for a few, but God's mission is for the world. We see this also in Psalm 67. And this is what I brought out a lot in that sermon. If you want to go back and listen to that, you see it in the purpose statements. That the ends of the earth may fear God. That your way may be known on the earth. And how does God achieve this message of salvation to the world? Well, he does it by blessing his people. By the way, that goes all the way back to Abraham, didn't it? Doesn't it? So when you think about Abraham's call in Genesis 12, God called Abraham and he blessed him, right? Blessed Abraham and said, I'm going to bless you and bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. And through you, the nations will be blessed. Through you, all the nations will be blessed. Well, that's what's happening here. The psalmist is praying that God would bless us as God's people. That the way that your way may be known on the earth. So this is kind of he's praying the Abrahamic blessing here, praying that God would the message of God's salvation would go to the world through his blessing of his people. So it's a good message to end on, I think, on this day, September 17th, 2021. It's been a long day. September 17th, 2021. Hope you have a great rest of the day.